Yeah, so my name's Tait. Most people will probably know me better from Twitter as Pwn All the Things. And I'm here at SAS giving the keynote talk, so I'm very excited to be here. Sure, so I was asked here to come and give a talk about disinformation, and I thought there was an interesting topic to have a look at disinformation historically, not just this disinformation that we've seen since 2016, but also what disinformation looked like before then, during the Soviet Union, perhaps even further back, more historically than that. Sure, so in my talk I wanted to talk a little bit about disinformation and how that had taken place historically, especially really since the Cold War. And one of the things that I found very interesting when studying it was how much things like the 2016 election disinformation that was going on is actually, there's lots of evidence of similar things taking place earlier. One of the things that I thought was very interesting was, for instance, during 2014, there was hacks against the Ukrainian elections, and there was a group called Cyberberkut, which was releasing disinformation. They had managed to hack emails and documents from George Soros. One of the things that was very interesting is that they doctored those emails before they published them for an internal Russian domestic audience. And we were able to see, because they published the same documents via a different distributor called DCLeaks, where they hadn't doctored those documents, we were able to see both the doctored ones and the undoctored ones in order to prove categorically that these had, this forgery had taken place. Sure, so one of the things that was very interesting when looking through the history of disinformation in the Cold War was that the head of the East German Stasi, for instance, had mentioned that the way that they do active measures back in the 50s and the 60s was that they would look for cracks in society and they would try and drive a wedge through them. And from his analysis, he said that it wasn't possible to create new cracks in society, but once you had discovered where they were, you could drive a wedge through them in order to cause breaks in the structure of society itself. Sure, so I think the 2016 election was a good example of a perfect storm for disinformation, that there was a lot of very significant fractures in US society, and that those were very easy, I think, to exploit. I'm a little bit more cautiously optimistic about the future. I think some of these cracks are now starting to close, that I think the media has a better understanding as to what disinformation is. They're a little bit better at protecting against it. I think people are now less inclined to believe when someone says, for instance, there's a 98% chance that one candidate will win versus the other. I think people are now willing to say, well, that 2% matters. So I think that there was a perfect storm in 2016. I think that that will be a little bit different in the future. Well, one of the real difficulties with technology is that anyone can now start a website and call it news. This is something that didn't used to be the case. It used to be very difficult to create your own newspaper. And so editors had this huge role in being able to make sure that the stories that people were reading were broadly accurate. Whereas now we have large numbers of websites which pretend to be news and are just, providing straight up garbage. And so I think that this is one thing that has changed. I think groups like Facebook perhaps have a bit of a responsibility to help inform users when they're accessing websites that are really just peddling complete garbage. And I think that there's a lot of tools and techniques that they can do to help alert users when stories really don't have any factual basis. But beyond that, I think ultimately it is up to users and to customers at home to think quite carefully about the news that they're consuming. Sure, so I think one of the really good things is that people are now starting to take this seriously. Certainly in 2016, at the height of this, people like myself were telling people this is a problem and we're not being listened to, and now what we're really seeing is we're seeing that people are taking this seriously. In the United States, we have Congress holding lots of meetings and hearings to try and understand how they can prevent some of this from taking place in future. We see companies like Twitter and Facebook and Microsoft and Google all starting to take this very seriously and saying that, actually we do have a responsibility to protect users from disinformation campaigns by nation states.